Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. We are here to discuss terrorism in the digital age. We have six, or indeed five, enormously experienced and knowledgeable commentators and an engaged audience and 1 hour, so it will be a challenge. Historically, as we know, terrorists have used fairly primitive tactics in order to get our attention. They simply can plant a bomb and exploit our media, and rely on our media, our sophisticated media, to spread the word and spread the terror they're trying to instill. They haven't needed new technologies or high-level technologies. They've been able to exploit their weakness. Because they've been weak, they've been poor, they haven't needed much in the way of technology. But as we know, technology is becoming cheaper by the day and falling into the hands of terrorists. And so the particular point we want to explore today is how is the digital age affecting contemporary terrorism? How are terrorists using the digital media to forge connections and to enhance their strength? Secondly, how can we exploit our greater access to technology to counter them effectively? And if we have time, we'll then move on to trying to imagine how terrorists' use of technology is likely to evolve in the future. So to help us address these questions, we have an enormously distinguished panel, as I said. To my immediate left, we have His Excellency Professor Yemi Osinbajo, who is the Vice President of Nigeria. To his left, we have Mr. Rob Wainwright, who is Director of Europol. Next to Rob, we have His Royal Highness Prince Turki Al Faisal Al Saud, who is the chairman of the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies in Saudi Arabia. We have General Raheel Sharif, who until recently was Chief of Staff of the Pakistani Army. And finally, Mr. Jean-Paul Laborde, who is Assistant Secretary General and Executive Director of Counterterrorism at the United Nations in New York. So perhaps I could start with you, Your Excellency. What do you think, how do you think, and Lord knows your government has had a great deal of experience in countering terrorism. Has the digital age affected how terrorists have operated and how they have forged international links in Nigeria?
Oh, yes, certainly. I think, that, of course, on a general level, the ability of terrorists to quickly connect and to interact very quickly is one that has been, vastly enabled by digital technology. But for us, it's perhaps even a little less sophisticated, a little less dramatic. Just yesterday, in a university, there was a Boko Haram bomb attack in a university. And what had simply happened was that there were two children, one possibly about the age of 12, another possibly even younger, a girl and a boy, who were obviously kitted with explosives. And the explosives were detonated remotely. And that's what we believe were detonated remotely. And that's happened before. Now, the use of mobile telephony to enhance these kinds of bombs and to detonate these kinds of bombs has again turned things around in terms of what we should be looking out for and how we should be fighting, especially suicide bombings and those kinds of things, because again here are young children. They obviously do not even know what's going to happen next, and they are really just sent as human bombs. And then these things can be detonated. Now, that would have been very difficult many years ago, but now everyone has access to, smartphones, everyone has access to phones, and even sometimes online, people learn to use these kinds of devices, all of these IEDs and several other types of devices. So I think that at every level, at the very sophisticated level, and at those relatively low levels, the challenge is significant.
Thank you.
Yes, I'd agree. I think Daesh is using technology and the internet in ways that we've never seen a terrorist group use before, and to such an extent that at least what we see in Europe, and of course we all know that Europe has suffered greatly from terrorism, especially in the last 2 years, is that it's become part of the battleground, I think, now, on the front line for fighting terrorism. Firstly, because of the scale that we're dealing with. Twitter alone removing some 250,000 accounts connected with Daesh in a little over a year. And of course, not just Twitter. What we found at Europol through our European Counterterrorism Centre is some 90 different social media platforms that terrorist group is using in a highly enterprising, flexible way. Difficult, therefore, to contain it with such flexibility and resilience like that. The speed of it, we're seeing 1 million hits on a very professionally made video, so-called celebrating the attacks on Paris just over a year ago. 1 million hits within 36 hours as well. So the technology is advanced. They know what they're doing. They know how to use it and why they're using it, of course, mainly for communication purposes. It's acting as effectively an echo chamber to spread their radical beliefs, of course, in a way to recruit, firstly, more and more followers, to recruit impressionable, in the main, young men, to incite them to carry out so-called lone actor attacks. And many of the attacks that we've suffered in Europe in recent times can be directly connected, I think, to the process by which this ugly propaganda has turned their heads, but also recruitment of foreign terrorist fighters who have then gone to the region to join Daesh as well. Some recent innovations just as worrying. The first examples, at least in Europe, of live streaming of attacks. It's that in itself, I think, promotes a certain attraction, at least within the minds of some people as well. And we saw that for the first time when the police officer and his wife was killed in Munionville in the summer of last year. Of course, better known, I think, and better established also with other groups like Al-Qaeda is the extent to which technology is used for communication purposes, and encryption especially. That's not such an innovation by ISIS, Daesh, but it's still something that's a major feature. And finally, as a financing operation, some innovative crowdfunding operations that are being used by some members of the group as well. So in many, many ways, seeing technology in the social and digital age that we've never seen before, as I said, putting it on the front line of the fight against terrorism.
Thank you. And what about the situation in Saudi Arabia? Do you think this is similar, or are you facing different issues?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. This is pretty much universal, what my predecessors talked about. If I can describe terrorism as a cancer, where the terrorist cell uses these modern methods to metastasize and to affect the rest of the body. That is how the modern technology is being used today. In the 60s and the 70s, when Europe and the rest of the world was going through another period of terrorism, Red Brigades, all the various Badr Meinhof, etc., the lack of these facilities that they have today kept them pretty much within a certain borderline, if you like. Now it is universal. A hit in Paris is reflected by 1 million strikes, as the gentleman said, from everywhere. And also, so it's not just the technology, but the fact that it is available to these people, and very much within the handheld cell phone. That makes it very easy to use and very, very much a menace to the rest of society. But one other thing I think that people should keep in mind is that the terrorists are much, much, much quicker in action than those who counter them, because of these tools that they have in their hands. And because they have no responsibility to a hierarchy above them, governments are. And so the communication within governments limits the speed with which the governments can respond to the terrorists. So this gives them another advantage, that they can act almost instantaneously. And if you have live streaming, well, then you have even a quicker way and a more current way of not only showing what you do, but also recruiting and propagandizing and all of that.
General Sharif, you've been in the front line of countering terrorism. Do you think these advantages that we've heard that terrorists have, the ability to act quickly and to use these new methods of communication, give them an advantage?
It gives them a huge advantage, and I must agree with my panelists. It's not only a cancer, it's the most deadly cancer. And I personally feel these terrorists have the ability to mutate, to morph, and they can do that very quickly. And obviously, this platform of digital age that is available, whether it is social media or any other platform which is available, they use it very, very effectively. And recruitment is one thing which is done on that. And I think the financiers, the bettors, the facilitators, the sleeper cells, and the sympathizers, all of them are involved in this. And I totally agree with His Highness. You know, there's a requirement to, for the free world to gel together and to react in such a fast pace. I would like to say that we need to go on a search to get rid of this menace. And they plan their attacks very well. They want glorification. If you see the timings, if you see the choice of the targets, there's a method to this madness. It's not that somebody from the cave is just planning it. It's much more to it. And they have been very, very successful in it. And I think we have been late in time. But if I just say a few words about my country, Pakistan, and the region, we were having around 150 odd incidents a month. And from that, we came down to a single figure in 2016. And now, with the help of God Almighty, we have one odd incident in 1 or 2 months. So from bit to bit, you know, or you can say from hours to days to weeks and to months. And there we are in months. And I'm sure we'll have that first 1 year. But as you said, it's a very, very deadly thing. And we all need to put our act together and react against it.
Thank you very much. And the perspective from the UN, I imagine you have less in the front lines countering them with force and more at the political end, is that right?
Well, I can see here, you have already 1, 2, 3, 4 regions of the world. And almost the same constatations, that communication, they are excellent in communication, terrorist organizations, and then they use the digital for that. Operations, depending on the countries, you have, for example, what the Vice President said, well, it's not as sophisticated as it is in Daesh, but they used to detonate. So they use a different way. And then Pakistan is a country in which you had this type of also phenomenon, which was effectively reduced, as you said, General, under your leadership. And operations are also very close to digital. Many operations of Daesh were conducted through messaging, I mean the instructions, and then after the detonation, etc. So, and finally, I think the financing, which is also very important for me. And the financing also shows us that the terrorist organizations are not only terrorist organizations. Mainly now they are also very much linked with organized crime. For example, do you know that the resources of Daesh, just an example, come from 5 to 7%, between 5 and 7, depending on the assessment, from drug trafficking. What happens in Afghanistan? A huge amount of funds come from the drug trafficking also. So don't forget these links, and at the level of the UN, we have not forgotten that. What was said also, and this is a final point, we are always a step behind. And because terrorism is a global threat, which requires a comprehensive answer, I will take the example of, for example, of international cooperation. We have not to be a step behind, and we have to use this type of digital age to fight them the same way that they fight us. I know that it is difficult, because also we have to do that under the umbrella of the rule of law, and this is what also something is difficult, but we have to do that, and this is why the only way to go is really to have a very solid and good international cooperation network. And this is where the UN, I think through the Security Council, but also through the center, the UN Center on Counterterrorism, should really be the repository of good practices, give to the country, hey, you have done that, for example, on the borders. I just spoke with the general on the borders. Pakistan has done a very important work. On Boko Haram, you have done in the issue of the foreign terrorist fighters also. So that's what has to be shared, exchanged. And during the next round, I will explain how to do that.
Oh, well, you've got to start now then. Why, let's face it, international cooperation has not been that effective against terrorism. Why not?
Why not? First of all, because I feel that the countries should be, excuse me, I speak from I used to be a judge in my Supreme Court in my country, so I feel that we are not disciplined enough to have the type of offenses which can really be connected to each other. I mean that's something very technical, but also very practical. We have to use the conventions against terrorism, which are the ones of the UN, to have at least an understanding about what we want to face. For example, explosive. Okay, fine. The terrorist by explosive. That's that. Let's have an offense in the countries which could be the same or at least similar in many countries. Second, we have also to work with the companies, which is also something very new for us. I mean, normally security was in the past the prerogative of states. No, now we have to work, and we have engaged with all the big companies of the world now to work with them to see what they can provide, for example, the prosecutors, what they can give freely, not even speaking about the freedom of speech or privacy, what they can give without infringing all of that. And also what we have to do is to, in my view, also to speak with the civil society, because you will not fight terrorism from only a state or a company perspective. This is a triptych that you have to have. Civil societies, companies, and state. We don't work against the people. We work for the people. And at the end of the day, we know very well that states, companies, and civil societies are victims of this phenomenon. This is what we do.
Yes, please. Yes.
Absolutely right, because in Pakistan also it was a whole of nation approach. Yes. And I think that paid. We had some very horrendous attacks, like the school incident, yes, in which over 135 children were killed, and martyred. So everybody came together and gelled together. So I think at the international level also there is a requirement to have synergy in effect and to have a platform. And UN resolution like 1373 says it all. Everybody has a responsibility. And I think, as you said, about the digital age, and I think intelligence sharing is key to success against terrorism, and that's very, very important. And if there is intelligence shared and there's actionable intelligence, and if people work on it, the countries react to it, I think it can bring in a marked difference.
Intelligence sharing, though, I think is one of the main stumbling blocks in the fight against terrorism. I don't know if things have changed since I was in intelligence, but there was always the third-person rule about sharing intelligence. That is, if I share intelligence with you, you're not allowed to share it with your neighbor unless you come back to me and ask me if you can share it. And that puts a big constriction on the immediacy of the sharing of the intelligence. So this counter-terrorism center in the UN, I think, is very important in overcoming some of these bureaucratic obstacles, as well as some of the financial obstacles that face countries in general, and the human resource obstacles. There are many countries if you look at, for example, some of the Sahel countries in Africa, they lack human resources and they lack financial resources to meet the challenge of these terrorists. And by the time that a world response comes to help these countries, it may be too late. They're already established there. They have found their own place and so on. Another factor, of course, is what we're facing in our part of the world, which is the failed states. If you take the situation in Syria, for example, or in Iraq, or in Yemen, the state is no longer capable of meeting these challenges. In Pakistan, they have done well for themselves, as the General mentioned. They brought down the incidents from several a year to less than one, and perhaps will be improving further. So there is a need by the world community to look into how the failed states can be brought back to meet these challenges.
Your Excellency, we're hearing a lot about international cooperation and mobilizing all facets of society in the counter-terrorist campaign. Has this been your experience in Nigeria too? Have you been getting the international collaboration you'd like?
Yes, to a very large extent. I mean, we work with the Lake Chad Basin countries and other frontline countries around our zone, around our region. For me, I think there is I think in developing a response, I think there is a need to work on how to delegitimize ideology that is so potentially so dangerous. And frankly, I think, yes, a great deal of attention needs to be spent on how to deal with the technical issues around controlling information that gets into cyberspace and all of that. But I think that there must be counter-information. There must be some information out there that delegitimizes these kinds of ideologies. And I think a lot more time needs to be spent on that. The other thing is really the autonomy that each person has. Each person who has a digital appliance, a digital device, has tremendous power, and you don't even require any formal agreements. I mean, just putting out your information out there, it can reach large numbers of people. How to deal with, because this is it's absolutely new, and we have to ask ourselves, how do you deal with those issues where, one person can do so much harm, by just simply putting out this kind of information out there. I think that we are really in a place that obviously the world has never been before. But our responses must be new. They must be nuanced, because again, look at issues of freedom of expression, and how that in some senses has affected the way that we're approaching this. We're restrained. We're walking gingerly around international human rights rules and of course freedom of expression and those kinds of things, because that's how we've been to use the expression, brought up. But we simply have to take a second look at all of those kinds of issues. We have to take a second look. What is freedom of expression today? I mean, obviously we're seeing it being approached in legislation on terrorism, anti-terrorism legislation and all of that. But I think there's still a broader conversation to be had as to how to look at the whole question of, freedom of expression when you have these kinds of challenges. How does that play out? How do you deal with these issues? And there must be consensus. There must be international consensus. Otherwise, you're going to have rogue behavior in these things.
Are you saying there's a conflict between freedom of expression and countering terrorism, effectively?
The point I'm really making is that our freedom of expression traditions and our whole orientation affects our thinking about how to deal with terrorism, especially cyber terrorism. I think that we are restrained. I think that we are, of course, this is the way we've always thought about these things. As a matter of fact, time was when someone would say that even if it was what is described today as hate speech, it is still permissible so long as it wasn't libelous, so long as it were, and countries where strict rules applied about hate speech, sedition, and those kinds of things. That was old school. But all of a sudden, we're finding that we've got to rethink our way, and I think it's just more a mindset. And I think that there's a need for us to just deconstruct that so that we can be more open-minded about dealing with the issues of terrorism.
About that, we have exactly on this issue, upon the initiative of Egypt, by the way, who was the president of the Security Council at that time, we have launched an initiative which is an international framework on counter-narrative and to understand exactly what could be done on this issue. That's something very important, of course, obviously. And it has to be done again with all the elements of the society, all the elements that we can get, and also the private companies. This is why, by the way, the work of the forum on the cybersecurity also is so important, and I have to praise the work of the group led by Jean-Luc Vess about that, because it's a very an important work on this issue.
This must be something the Europol thinks a lot about, how to delegitimize an ideology, how to have a new and nuanced approach. Do you think it's possible to construct an effective counter-narrative?
Yeah, well, it's essential, and it is part of the European Union agenda in this space as well, of course. But we have to deal with it in a way to reconcile what are contradictory forces. We want to enjoy, we want to protect the freedom of the internet, but not to such an extent that there are absolutely no rules of governance and no effective means by which law enforcement and other security agencies can monitor and indeed prevent terrorist activity. And going back to the point that the General and His Royal Highness were making earlier, I think there are other contradictory forces which are at play in dealing with the modern manifestations of terrorism. You're right, General, it requires an all-of-national response, but actually the extent to which terrorism operating today on the internet, exemplified by that, means it has to be more than that. It has to be an all-of-region, indeed all-of-global response. And yet, for very good reasons, of course, terrorism is a national security issue that roots it very much in political, legal, operational terms in something that's within the geographical boundaries of a state. And indeed, in the European Union, we have political red lines, we have legal red lines in our treaties that make sure that that is the case. So how do you reconcile that and the need to protect intelligence very closely and be very careful about sharing it with the fact that you're facing something that's long since become a regional global challenge? That's the gap, the policy gap that we have to bridge through pretty smart solution. And what we do at Europol is try to leverage the extent we can build trust within the counter-terrorist and policing communities. And in this space of the digital age, operate as a single platform to coordinate police activity and make referrals to all of these social media platforms. So there is a way of doing it, but it's about reconciling separate interests sometimes in a modern and smart way.
But, please.
When I was referring to this whole-of-nation approach, obviously, I just gave an example, and you're absolutely right. It has to be at the international level. And I'll say that these freedom of speech and other things like human rights and all, they are limitations, and they are difficult to handle when you are dealing with hardcore terrorists. And if you talk of human rights, I'll just give an example again of about 100-odd mothers whom I met after the incident. Myself, my wife, we were there, and they were all demanding that they should be caught and apprehended and hanged there in the school premises. So somebody mentioned about human rights, so they just literally got hold of me and said that, what about our human rights? So there is a balance which is required, and especially for those, I would say, hardcore terrorists who have been holding heads of two of my soldiers, one in each hand, and playing football with the third one. So there is a need to deal with these terrorists in a very firm, in a very bold, audacious, and I personally feel in a manner that it creates deterrence. Obviously, the norms and other rules and regulations need to be followed, but I think that's the way forward for those who, and then the second point, obviously, the counter-narrative, that is very, very important. In fact, the same vehicle which they are using, I personally feel we should be using it better than that. And this counter-narrative should be going out day in, day out. And all our youth and the people who get radicalized or who get impressed and all this narrative should be so potent, so strong that it should nullify everything.
Sorry to interrupt. It's fake news. It's effectively an example of this phenomena that we're dealing with now. Maybe we need to have a tweetified response to it, because it is just fake news. Mm-hmm. And the same challenge around how we can identify it and persuade our peoples that it is fake news and not to be carried seriously and followed seriously. And again, it's the very open nature of the internet and the social media platform, which in most respects is a fantastic benefit for us, but it's a very open, unregulated nature that allows for this form of fake news to be spread in such voluminous and effective way. That is the root cause, I think, of this particular problem we're talking about in this panel.
But we have been singularly unsuccessful in doing this.
No, that's not true. Absolutely
in the US,
not true.
We look at the State Department Office of Public Diplomacy. I don't think you'll find a person who would argue that this has been a successful enterprise, even though it's been well led. Even though we haven't successfully engaged in the way that we need to. If we had, we wouldn't need to sit here.
Well, the number of people that have been radicalized and persuaded to travel to Syria and Iraq from the United States, Western Europe, and if I speak from the regions that I know, have dried up, effectively.
Surely that's because of the military defeat of ISIS, not because of being persuaded it's a bad idea.
That's your assessment. I might have a different one. I think that's part of it, and I don't think it's as simplistic as that.
Timing would imply it's more than just part of it.
No, because it began before the serious military decline of ISIS. I agree with you, that is certainly a contributory factor, as indeed a more aggressive response by the security and law enforcement agencies, especially in Europe. But I would expect also that the counter-narrative is beginning to have some effect. I agree with you, it's very much an uphill battle. I wouldn't call it singularly unsuccessful. I think that's a bit hard on those that are engaged in this. And it remains a very serious challenge, but there are some success that we're finding out there.
If I could go back to the General. General, do you think you can deter somebody who is prepared to sacrifice their own life and their family's life?
One can deter, why not? If there's a proper mechanism in place, and if there are courts which can take decisions, and in our case, I'll openly admit we had the military courts, and 170 odd individuals were convicted and punished. There's a number of them given death sentence. Obviously, there's still a very large number which is going through the process, and I must admit also that this was need of the hour. It was unusual time, so for that unusual, you can say, arrangement was required. So we did that, and there is deterrence, which obviously those who are in the pipeline, those who are gradually getting indoctrinated and all, they do get deterred. So I think apart from a kinetic operation, there's a development prong which is required, and with that, this deterrence has to be in place, and it does work, in my opinion.
Education, man, is the most important place to start to get the counter-narrative. And that can only happen in schools, in mosques, in churches, in social gatherings, etc., etc. And using the modern tools as the terrorists use them to convince others to join them also is important. But also the other thing that is equally important is to try not to punish the innocents while you're dealing with the criminals. And this is also something that, unfortunately, in some cases, hasn't happened. The collateral damage has wide effect on a society or on a group of people. So, but what are you to do? As the General said, you have to have rigid and very enforceable conditions under which you operate. But at the same time, you must keep in mind that not to eliminate a terrorist and create 10 others. That is equally important to keep in mind. And that can only happen if there is very strong coordination between the world community on these issues, which unfortunately until today I don't think yet exists. It's improving, but it's not there yet.
Yes.
And de-radicalization as well is important. The young people who go to Syria, for example, you must offer them a chance to come back. And not simply because they went to Syria, they're considered die-hard terrorists and punishable by death or by elimination or whatever. There must be means of inviting them back and using family, using the other social contacts that they may have had can sometimes work. And in the kingdom, there is a radicalization program, which is a work in progress. But it's helped in convincing at least a number of these terrorists that what they're doing is wrong and that they must come back and work within their society. Not to break the leash or the link with them. Give them a way out to come back.
Yeah, I see a lot of heads nodding around the circle here.
But I'll just like to, because, about my previous comments, we are running 7 de-radicalization centers, and we have about 2,500 individuals. Sabaun is the name of the center, which is being light at the end of the day. So that is, those are being run. 2,500 individuals have come out of that. We involve the families. We have NGOs and everybody's working on it. In fact, we have experienced and we have delivered a number of fields. It is about 3,38,000 families, which is over 800,000 people, were moved out of an area. That area was about 8,000 square kilometers. So 8,000 square kilometer area, people were moved out. Then we carried out the operation, and I'm very happy to state that around 90% have gone back, to those areas. So we cleared the area, moved them back, and so all this has happened with a theme, build better than before, and obviously poverty, education, health, and all these things. We even gave them polio drops, and Robert Gatewood rang me up and thanked me. So that's the type of, that's what I was saying. There's a whole of nation approach required, and there is a full team behind it. So only then, it's not only it's not only an operation. It has to be a concept which deals with all these dimensions. Only then one can bring down terrorism and control extremism.
There's a shocking amount of agreement around the circle here. I think we may need to bring the audience in, but first of all, Jean-Paul.
No, what I want to say is that, of course, we need a real policy. You cannot only go to actions. And this is something, for example, in concerning the digital issues, to come back to that. For example, the impact, if we want to have a counter-narrative, the impact of somebody who has been deradicalized and who can speak about the process under which he was radicalized, it's something which has really an impact. Or, unfortunately, when we have so many victims, some of them can also speak about that, which really give the sense of the acts of terrorism. But out of that, we need to have a counter-violent extremist policy. We have to have prevention of policy. As you said, education is really something which is important, in which, by the way, the people who are radicalized and who have been de-radicalized have to really be there. The impact is enormous when you have that. So that's where we start with. Prevention is You know, it's like a crime at the end. Eh? You need the real policy with prevention, and then after that, operation, and then de-radicalization, and the prisons also issues which have to be treated very, very seriously. So all of that, in order to prevent this, what is a topic of today, this terrorism and digital connections.
Thank you. I'd like to invite any questions or comments from the floor. Yes, please.
Can I come? I don't need
I think it's a small enough room. You're probably fine.
Thank you very, very much for being here today. The terrorists themselves, you know, could be attributed because of their religious fanatics. But I think the role of sympathizers internationally is hugely significant. Why is it that enormous swathes of citizens turn a blind eye and a deaf ear to what really could be much more of a pressure and a movement opposing these? So there's religious fanaticism in the terrorists, but surely the sympathizer is less the religious fanatic, but the one complaining or being a victim of corruption in their governments, unhappiness with how they live their lives. So what I'm saying here is that the terrorist is almost a single person compared to what condones the action and allows this to happen on a huge scale. And that leads also to very quick radicalization.
Thank you.
Cynicism.
Yes,
Cynicism is the worst tool of these sympathizers. They don't go and do the terrorist act. We had the case of a person in the kingdom, much reported in the press, who at one time in his lifetime was a sympathizer, not necessarily of terrorist acts, but of acts of opposition, let's say, to established order or to certain ideas and directions. And he was urging young people to go and fight for the rights of Muslims to protect themselves, etc., putting it in a halo type of approach. And one day, the Ministry of Interior received a call from this person saying, please, can you stop my son from going across the border into an area of conflict? And this is a typical way for these sympathizers who are willing to see others die for certain issues, but not themselves or their loved ones. So you're right, the sympathizers and anybody who beats the drum for these terrorists should be included in the way that the treatment for and the dealing with the terrorists is undertaken. And that cannot be done simply by legislation. No. It must be done through a social makeup, the holistic approach that the General was talking about, the whole nation or the whole community participating in it.
It just depends on the particular terrorist phenomena that we have. So in the days when terrorism in Europe was more characterized by separatist movements like the IRA in Britain and Ireland and ETA in Spain and France, then there was a cause that was capable of being sympathized with, perhaps, among sections of the public. If I compare that with what we have in Europe today, I don't see groundswell of sympathy, at least not natural levels of sympathy, with the aims of, certainly not the actions of ISIS. Now, the community of radicalized members or potential members is indeed large and worrying so, but no groundswell sympathy for their actions. I don't see it at all. 2 years ago this month, in response to the Charlie Hebdo attacks in Paris, you'll remember, there were millions of people, French people, that came out to the streets to say "Je suis Charlie" and indeed copied around Europe in major cities. Quite a powerful statement, actually, and a natural popular reaction that wasn't stage managed by any politicians. And that's stuck in my mind, I think, at least in the region that I work. So depends. And once again, we go back to the point about how do you characterize, how do you define terrorism, because there are many different forms.
I would just draw a distinction there, if I could, between sympathy with actions of terrorists and sympathy with their aspirations. I think even in the case of the ETA and the IRA, I don't think there was a great deal of sympathy for their actions. There was sympathy with their aspirations. I think we see much of that today. There's certainly not sympathy with the atrocities committed by Daesh and so on, but certain sympathy with a feeling of a community that is lost out, a sense of anger against the authorities, the world, whoever. So I think one can distinguish between sympathy for actions and sympathy for aspirations. But anyway, let me bring in this gentleman right here.
Hello. Yeah, I just want to kind of build on what that lady said over there. That they need some grounds for recruitment, and maybe she was talking about injustice or misgovernance or things like that. But I think there are other things as well. The proxy wars which are being fought around the globe today. What's happening in Syria? What happened in Afghanistan? Wars which have nothing to do with those people over there. People are dying, and the whole world is watching. And when people watch that injustice, like she's saying, it gives ground for recruiting. And those are the grounds which create those feelings. So is it time maybe we should actually raise our voices to the people who are fighting those proxy wars and call a spade, because that is what is going to add to the recruitment today. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Again, I see nodding of heads in response to that. The gentleman behind you.
My question is for the general and about this tension between fighting the Taliban when there are sympathizers within the population who may not be in the tens, but maybe in the hundreds of thousands who are supporting them. How do you deal with this sort of tension? How do you go after the Taliban when there are large parts of the population who might be giving them shelter or maybe sympathizing with them and approving what they do? I'm just wondering if you can give us some insight as to how Pakistan dealt or continues to deal with this issue.
Yes. May I answer?
Please.
The circumstances in Pakistan are difficult. There are huge challenges, and we need to understand those challenges. For example, we have over 3 million Afghan refugees in Pakistan for last over 30 years. We have a 2,400-kilometer border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, which is a porous border. We have intertribal linkages. There are a number of villages which are, you can say, divided villages in a sense that you can, have dinner in one house and then have lunch in the other, and you will be on the other side of the border. And then you have, as you said, a lot of people who are intermarriages, and so the milieu or the environment is pretty difficult. But Pakistan is managing that. Once we launched this Operation Zarbe-Azb, we decided that we will establish writ of our country, writ of Pakistan, writ of the government in all the areas. So now the writ of the government exists in whole of Pakistan, and the border is being managed. There are difficulties on the other side. There are pockets in Afghanistan where there are a lot of all these organizations, a lot of terrorists and the groups are there. And then there's a talk of various tribes and various networks like Haqqanis and all. So that all is dependent on the situation in Afghanistan. So we hope and pray. It is our brotherly country, and we hope and pray that stability returns to Afghanistan. And ours and Afghan destiny obviously is linked. And I personally feel the moment there is stability in Afghanistan, things would improve.
The media, ma'am. We haven't talked about the media.
Please.
They have enormous role to play in either promoting or opposing what is happening in the world today. And unfortunately, the sensationalism attracts the media. And these terrorists, they aim to raise the sensational aspects of their acts. Hence, we see the beheadings, we see the burnings, we see all of that. And the media simply spreads it around. And I think that there is a need for a rethink on what the role of the media should be, not just in the West, but throughout the world community. And in addition to that, within the media, there is the issue of the double standard that some people feel is applied to their causes or to their interests and their beings. And this is also glorified by the media, and is something that is pointed to by these terrorists as a means of recruiting others by saying, look what they're promoting here, or look what they're saying there and not there. So there is a need also within the Counterterrorism Center, I think, for these issues to be thoroughly investigated and researched and proposals made to meet the challenges.
Thank you.
And one more quick comment
Yes.
about various conflicts that are going on in the world. I personally feel there is a requirement to resolve these conflicts, but that would also, like Kashmir is one, Palestine is one, another conflict. And once we do that, I'm sure, again, it would help in having a better understanding, better harmony in various regions.
Thank you. Vikram Segal.
Louise, I'm wanting to hear about the nexus between corruption, organized crime, and terrorism. You just take it that terrorism cannot function without organized crime. A terrorist cannot walk out with a suicide jacket. He doesn't get explosives off the shelf. He doesn't get transportation, logistics, safe areas. He doesn't get intelligence. This all comes from organized crime, identity documents, etc. Organized crime is fed by corruption. And in many cases, corruption definitely fosters this organized crime to control areas. Right? We have seen that happening in Pakistan. And we've seen it happening in this thing. Unfortunately, the West does not look at the proceeds of corruption going to the West. Right? I mean, you have around the Hyde Park, you have most of the biggest crooks in the world living there. Nobody does something about it, right? Because there is no real estate that says you can buy something not over 10,000 pounds in cash. But most of the property is beyond that. You cannot say, can you buy property without declaring the source of your income? Have you declared your tax return, or not even tax return, at least your tax registration from the country of origin? So I think we must look at corruption as a figure, as this thing. Go after that.
Thank you. Anyone like to comment on that?
Yeah.
Yes, please, Jean-Paul.
Well, not only corruption, but as you said, there is corruption, which is one of the means of organized crime. That's where the problem is. And the more and more, especially now with Daesh, you can see the reduction. I just take this example. I don't say that it is only that, but with the reduction of the territory, it means less resources. Of course, they have still the resources coming from the taxes, etc. But still, they were engaging more and more in organized crime. The diffusion also of corruption into societies is something which, of course, diminishes the values. And then, these people who are looking at internet can say, okay, look, Daesh is promoting great values, whatever is wrong, but because of the society is not what it should be. So that's obviously the work against organized crime has to be one of the components. And even more, I say, if you attach organized crime with terrorism, it means that you will diminish the value of the people who said, yes, we are fighting for the right cause. You cannot fight for the right cause when you are using these methods of organized crime. I want to take one example here, another one. For example, when they, in Daesh, they request women to join, and they did that and they continue to do it, to join their rank, to support their ranks, to support Daesh, whatever the type of support they want from. You should know that after having, quote, using the services of these women, they sell them again to these networks of organized crime. And these ladies, in that case, are resold to somebody else. So that's so horrible that you can see that if we are good enough, I say, in terms of digital use, to really promote the fact, I mean, to not promote, to look at the facts and say what they do, and using, for example, even in Afghanistan, it's $200 million per year that support the Taliban and at Al-Qaeda also. So that's where I think we are not good enough. And this is where I really push my actions and try to do whatever we have to do in terms of good practices, sharing whatever has to be shared, and using the center for promoting these actions.
There's another important factor here. I agree with you in the sense that the profile of the terrorists, at least those that were responsible for the attacks that we've seen in Europe, are much more criminally affected, criminally formed by their background. They come up through a gang culture. Many of them have criminal traces, police files on them from low-level drug offences and so on. We haven't seen that in the past, because we're dealing with a different typology of terrorists compared to the rather more religiously convinced members of Al-Qaeda. We're dealing with different people that are different products of society with a criminal background. And that's important for the way in which we structure our response, going right back to where we started, which is why we have to envisage a more ambitious counter-terrorist response that breaks free from the national constrictions. Because we have to find a way of connecting the intelligence world with the police world more and more, because very often the data about who these people are, where they've come from, and who they're still in touch with will be as much in a police file, maybe even at a local level, as it will be in the files of the CIA or MI5. And that means our response has to be smarter and wider than it has been.
Can I, we don't have that much time left, and I wonder if I could ask you to think about the future. We've already said we've been slow in countering terrorists, we've been reacting to them. Do you have any sense, do you think about what they might do next, especially in this digital age? We've seen a new tendency is that they tend, certainly the European ones, to be more criminal. What do you worry about they're doing next?
Cyber warfare is available. And that is something that terrorists, by their knowledge of the technology of social media and so on, can very much address and use as a tool to enhance their projects. And I've read in various studies as well the worry about the more lethal, either radioactive or biological or chemical facilities and capabilities that may be at hand now because of modern technology and the spread of that modern technology throughout the world, where it might not be as well protected as in some other places, are equally things that we must keep in mind, that terrorists will not prevent themselves from using any means to advance their causes. So they'd be willing to use these issues.
I think the ability to hack into systems, even very advanced weaponry and those kinds of things, is a very real threat. I mean, and as technology improves, as you have even more sophisticated digital technology in developing weaponry, so the possibility that someone can hack into a very sophisticated system and control that resource in such a way as to do maximum damage somewhere. I think that it's just the whole irony of it is that technology is so important in everything, and we're making so much progress. But just as we make that progress, the weak underbelly, the obvious problem with that is that we also have the tendency that somebody somewhere who all he needs to do is to simply get into that system, can operate that system in such a way as to do really great damage. That I think might keep us awake at night, because we really need to find ways, perhaps ways of protecting systems more. And what we've seen even in the past few months, the past few years, shows that, hacking is becoming, an even more dangerous business, and certainly much more than just hacking into political party systems. I think that we should be really worried about the possibilities.
I'd agree. I think the logical extension of some of these groups becoming more and more tech savvy is something like that. And even if they don't have access to this capability, then they can simply buy it, frankly, on the darknet, where there's an enormous trade in cybercriminal technology that is available. That said, I think attacking the critical national infrastructure, at least of most countries, is a tough task, not easily done. And there's something that's not quite as immediate and showy as, firing automatic weapons in a theatre or in public. So I'm not sure that we'll see that, but I think it's clearly a scenario that we have to be concerned about. I'm also concerned about the extent to which Daesh, for example, has been quite smart in exploiting geopolitical trends. That's, in a way that it makes them more political and strategic than we've seen in the past. A deliberate, I think, exploitation of the migration crisis in a way that's aggravated the problem, I think, for Western governments in Europe. And they've acted, to infiltrate perhaps some of the routes and maybe even to infiltrate some of the refugee camps in a way that's had an adverse political effect. And I wonder if that was all part of their planning. So we are dealing perhaps with a more sophisticated actor in many different ways.
I'd also like to agree, because glorification, in my opinion, is something on which these terrorist organizations thrive. And that's why they choose the right moment, the right target and all. And so in that way, maybe in the future, the West, or the developed countries, they will have problem in a sense as far as this cyber is concerned. If it has to be something, it has to be spectacular in nature. And I hope it doesn't happen, and it would be very unfortunate. But that's what they have always been trying. So that would be something that one can see with this. But there is a requirement to have filters. There is a requirement to control the technology in a manner that it does not get into the hands. It's easier said than done, but there has to be something done about it. And I personally feel the international community needs to sit together, develop a counter-narrative, and develop, as far as this digital age is concerned, develop some system that we have a check on it.
Well, I think we're out of time. So if I can summarize where we are, there's, notwithstanding the fact that we have a very distinguished panel from very different parts of the world representing very different experiences, there's an enormous amount of agreement here that terrorists have indeed been very fast and agile in using the digital age to communicate, to recruit, and to propagandize, and that the best hope for an effective counter-terrorist campaign is one that has to marshal, on national terms, both the state and civil society and the private sector. But if it is to be effective, it also has to be international, and that it's incumbent upon us to figure out a way to construct a convincing counter-narrative to counter the ideologies being trafficked by these groups. Looking into the future, we're worried about their use of they're becoming more tech savvy, potentially using weapons of mass destruction, potentially hacking into weapons system, or through links with organized crime, even buying them. So I'm trying desperately to seek a positive note in which to end this.
I want to give you the positive
Go ahead.
note, because everybody agrees on the threat
yes.
and the future. But we are working on that, and we are working within the forum on this issue. Cybersecurity already, we have a Global Agenda Council. We are producing many elements, especially to trying to find what kind of core actions have to be made. Because in order to leave the freedom that you were speaking, President, the freedom of speech, the privacy, etc., we are working on that, and hopefully among all these elements of the societies, again, civil society, companies, and governments and international organizations, we can find a solution at least at the same pace This is a hope that we can have, that the terrorist organizations run their dramatic terrorist actions.
Thank you. Well, on that positive note, I'd like to invite you to join me in thanking our panelists for being with you.